Dr. Stephanie Malin, PhD, is an environmental sociologist specializing in natural resource sociology, governance, and rural development with a focus on the community impacts of resource extraction and energy production. Her main interests include environmental justice, environmental health, and activism. Stephanie serves as an associate professor in the Department of Sociology here at Colorado State University, and she is an adjunct professor with the Colorado School of Public Health. At Colorado State, Stephanie is an award-winning teacher of courses on environmental justice, water and society, and environmental sociology. She's also the author of The Price of Nuclear Power, Uranium Communities, and Environmental Justice. Please welcome Dr. Stephanie Malin.
Thank you. All right. Hello, everyone, again. Thank you again for being here. So I am going to talk a little bit about the social science side of what we're talking about today. Like Mike said, I'm a professor of sociology, an associate professor, so that means that I study the way in which our social world and social systems interact with our biophysical systems, right? What we might call or think of as natural systems. And I especially focus on the role of economic institutions and our tendency, especially since about the 1980s, as a society to focus on market-based economic solutions to most of the social and environmental problems we discuss. Just to give you a little sense of what an environmental sociologist does more broadly. So I look at how societies and economies interact with the natural world. I ask how resources within society are distributed. So those can be the good things, right? Like we have in Fort Collins, all the bike paths and parks and some access to public transportation. Those are environmental goods, right? The fact that we can look out the window and see a beautiful vista, that's an environmental good. But there are also a lot of environmental bads out there, right? And that's what we're focused on today, are those risks. The things in the environment, the toxicants, the hazards, that we don't fully understand their human health impacts or their public health impacts, but we're starting to understand that there are interactions there. So I focus on how are those resources distributed? Who is most exposed to the bads in society versus the goods? And there are hundreds of studies done in sociology that show that it's typically marginalized communities, so people of color, poorer communities, Native and indigenous communities, that are typically exposed more often to the outcomes of industrial society. But this is changing, right? And we can see this in the way that our extractive activity is pushing up against what we call peri-urban areas. So areas that we live in, right, that are kind of this rural-urban interface where a lot of people live in close proximity to other land uses. So those risks, and furthermore, who has a seat at the table to decide how do we distribute those risks? How do we zone activity like this? All of that matters and is a real focus of my work and other sociologists. So overall, what does this mean for sustainability? And for this set of issues especially, how does the institutional context factor in? Sociologists focus on institutions, right? So those organizations that we create to help us run society and run our economy. And we also focus on trust in those institutions, right? And who holds power? Power is this intangible thing that we don't tend to talk about a lot, but it's the bread and butter of sociological inquiry and social scientific analysis. So just to give you a little sense of what I'm doing. Now, we're all probably very aware of the Colorado context. We've already seen some maps kind of zooming in on some areas within the state, and you'll see many more. I just wanted to highlight this map, which was created by another one of our CSU professors, Melinda Laitori, and her graduate student, Carrie Boone. This shows us active oil and gas wells in Colorado, and this was data from 2015, so it's already dated. But what we can see here are permitted wells. So the light blue are the wells that are permitted already and were active, and the dark blue were permitted but not yet active, and are certainly active by now. So across Colorado, there are about 50,000 producing oil and gas wells, and there are about 20,000 of them, a little over 20,000, in Weld County alone. So as many of you are aware, right, Weld County has the largest number of oil and gas wells of any county in the United States. It's also one of the top 10 agricultural producing counties in the United States. It's number 6, last I checked. So there are lots of overlapping land uses. And if you notice, you can't even see Weld County on this map because it's obliterated by blue dots, right? Which means you can see all those active permits. There's also, of course, when we go over into the western slope, there's also a lot of hydraulic fracturing and unconventional oil and gas production there, impacting communities in very similar ways. But these communities are often more rural, and so they're less visible to us, right? But we want to be aware that this is going on in multiple parts of our state. Here along the Front Range, we're extracting primarily oil. Of course, natural gas comes with it. And then when we're talking about the Pissarros Basin and some of the activity going on the western slope, we're of course talking about predominantly natural gas extraction. Just so that we're aware of some of the differences, Colorado gets to participate in all of these, right? So as we know, in Colorado, we're experiencing this, right? Or maybe we're starting to become aware of it. There are a lot of social stressors related to unconventional oil and gas production. So we have two main issues, one being divided people, right, divided communities, and the other being contested governance. And there's a lot that's contested in this area, right? And we'll talk more about that as I present. But divided communities are a key issue for someone studying the social impacts especially, because we're seeing how benefits and costs of this industry are distributed unevenly. Right, remember I look at how our resources distributed, the goods and the bads, and who's exposed to what. Well, we're seeing that the benefits really accrue to industrial operators and a smaller cadre of folks. Of course, we have employment numbers in the state that have increased as a result of oil and gas, but we also notice that when there's a recession or when there's a bust in the oil industry like there was in 2015, employees are some of the first goods to be shed by a firm. Right? Really callous way of talking about it, but first the workers are the ones that are expendable. So these benefits and costs have been unevenly distributed, and the biggest cost here that's not really quantified are the costs to the public, to members of the public. And we'll often see in issues of industrial production like this or extraction that the risks, the costs are socialized or nationalized, meaning most of us have to deal with the repercussions. We might have to pay in terms of air filtration systems in our homes, or testing that we have to get done, or our increased medical expenses and unexplained health outcomes that we have to deal with, right, and pay for years down the road. So often the risks are nationalized, the costs are nationalized, right, socialized, we all deal with it. The profits are privatized and end up accruing to a very small set of actors, firms, or institutions. We also have a lot of land use conflicts in this state, which divides communities a lot in terms of who wants to see hydraulic fracturing in their backyard, pipelines as well, right, other phases of this kind of production. And we see a lot of conflict. That's kind of at the heart of what we're talking about. Contested governance is also really important here. Who decides zoning and access? And right now, of course, especially after the recent Martinez decision and the Colorado State Supreme Court decision in 2016 saying local governments do not have the capacity to control what's going on, we definitely see a state-dominated system of regulation in Colorado, which for a variety of reasons, we'll talk about what that means for most of us. To set the stage a little bit, our use of hydraulic fracturing and unconventional oil and gas production has made the US the #1 producer of hydrocarbons in the world. If you're interested in this kind of data, the Energy Information Administration has excellent data, and that's where this comes from. Colorado has seen oil extraction quadruple since the onset of hydraulic fracturing, especially since 2010, and natural gas extraction in our state has increased about 51% since 2010 as well. So just to clarify, what is hydraulically fractured and what's not? Hydraulic fracturing now accounts for about half of all oil production and 2/3 of all natural gas production. So when we look at these numbers, we can understand that this new suite of technologies, not new in that it hasn't been used for decades, but new in that it's now, because of deregulation, able to locate so close to so many of us, right? That this has really driven these increases. So I'm here today to tell you about some specific research that I've been doing with teams of folks, and John Adgate was the PI on this study. He'll be talking to us this afternoon. So this is a collaborative study that I'm going to give you results from, and it was funded by an arm of the National Institutes of Health, or NIH, called the National Institute for Environmental Health Sciences, or NIEHS. And this institution funds the kind of research that I do, where we look at, in the moment, what is going on in communities in terms of public health and environmental justice outcomes. And the reason why we were looking at this is because there's a growing body of evidence, even when we first got this grant in 2014, that there are serious impacts to public health and to vulnerable populations. And I have some studies cited there. There's also, of course, some longer references that you all have access to. And these studies are really starting to establish that there are some problems. But at a more of a core issue here, there were very strong, during my interviews and other folks' experiences out in the field, almost everyone I would talk to, even if they supported oil and gas extraction, they had well pads on their land. Many of the people I've interviewed in Colorado and Pennsylvania have well pads producing on their land. They're making money from it, right? They're ambivalent about how they feel, or they support the industry, but they're still seeing a lot of stress and diminished quality of life, even if they fully support the industry. So we wanted to dig into this, right? Is this happening in a way that we can measure rigorously? So we designed a study that was initially 2 years. It became a 3-year study because of the amount of people that wanted to participate and the number of communities we were involving. It's multi-sited, which means we did the study in multiple places, and we used a variety of methods. So I have done now almost 100 interviews with folks in Colorado about this issue. We've also been doing a multi-community survey between 2014 and 2015 in Greeley, in Windsor, and in Fort Collins, which was our control community. Our other research included photo voice, and you'll see some pictures from that in a moment, as well as our epidemiologists and exposure scientists. John Adgate, being one of those epidemiologists, led the biomarker part of the study, where we were fortunate enough to have volunteers who let us take a lot of samples from them, hair samples, cheek swabs, blood samples, to see if we could see biomarkers of stress, right? So see things like increased levels of cortisol and other things that you'll hear all about according to people's test results. So that's where this data is coming from. I want to remind us, I'm going to say this twice, institutional context matters, is what we're really seeing in this. Whether we trust or distrust the institutions that are enforcing regulations in the state really impacts how certain we feel about the information we're getting from them. And one of the biggest points of evidence that I'm seeing so far is that there's some major structural reasons for procedural inequity in the state. And procedural inequity simply means who has a seat at the table to decide the processes around where we zone these activities, and is there useful translated information that everyone has access to make decisions. Right? So it's not just about having a seat at the table. We need to be informed using information that the lay public can understand, because we can't all be toxicologists, right? We can't all be medical professionals. In terms of environmental justice, distributive justice and procedural justice are two very important components of that idea, right? The idea that we should all feel safe where we live, work, play, and pray. Distributive justice is all about where those bad things and good things are and who's exposed to them. And as I just said, procedural justice is about deciding that and having adequate information to make those decisions. Again, if you learn one thing from my presentation, right? Institutional context matters. And in this state, the fact that our institutional context really revolves around the COGCC, the Colorado Oil and Gas Conservation Commission, and the lack of trust that the public has reported feeling in this institution, primarily because of those procedural inequities, right? Because there isn't a lot of certainty about the information that we can glean from these regulatory institutions or from state health institutions. And we also we're hearing from our data that people don't feel like they have a lot of space to meaningfully interact with these regulators, especially during things like the oil and gas task force meetings and during public meetings where public comments are limited to about 3 minutes per person. So the major findings of this study are that the institutional and structural contexts around regulating unconventional oil and gas production, and that's just what UOG production means, unconventional oil and gas production in Colorado, contribute to some really important outcomes in terms of the social, scientific dynamics of this. People are reporting diminished quality of life, increased stress, and this is especially true for people who live closest to development, right? We saw those really compelling pictures of having well pads or other infrastructure 500 to 1,000 feet from your home or from parks, and living in host communities for a long time. Meaning if you've lived in Greeley for 30 to 40 years, you may be very used to this, right? Because Greeley has a long history of extractive activity and industrial production. If you live in Windsor, however, or Fort Collins for a long period of time and have seen changes in air quality as a result of these regional impacts, those impressions are often stronger the longer you've lived in these communities, according to our study. So there are two big mechanisms driving decreased or diminished quality of life and increased stress. The first mechanism here is uncertainty, right? So just the fact that people are not certain about anything. And our last presentation really drove that home, right? You can be an expert in these fields and still not have the data or the tests available to you, especially in a publicly accessible way, that allow you to understand anything about what's going on. People are uncertain about economic impacts, right? If we have increased seismic activity because of re-injecting fracking fluid, what does that mean for my home values? If we're seeing increased seismic activity in Greeley, what does that mean? More importantly, and more to the point, what does it mean when we have well pads located within view of our decks or our backyards? Do our homes have the same value that they would have before? And for many of our respondents or participants, this is the biggest, for most of us, right? This is the biggest investment you will ever make. A lot of retirees moving to Windsor in the Front Range. This is a huge investment for them. And the uncertainty surrounding that is enormous and stressful. The health impacts that we may or may not be exposed to by breathing the air that we're breathing, for example, very uncertain about that. And contested illness permeates this. And what that means is this argument that we have between our institutions, like our Colorado Public Health and Environment Department, or the COGCC, or other institutions, about whether they will listen to citizen-driven data and whether or not there are links between environmental exposure and health outcomes. Right now, there's still a huge paradigm shift going on where we tend to look at individual behaviors as the causes and drivers of illness, right? Things like diet, genetics, lifestyle, not the air we breathe, the water we drink or bathe in, right? And there's a growing body of evidence, a strong body of evidence, that environmental health matters and our health is linked to what's going on in the environment. So people are uncertain. People are uncertain about their safety, right? When we see explosions on the news, not necessarily due to current activity, but due to all of the orphaned infrastructure related to previous oil and gas booms in our state. How do people accurately assess risk, right? One of the biggest outcomes of not having certain or valid or useful information that you can use to make decisions is that you don't know how to assess risk. You don't know what this means if your child has these test results coming up. And there is not a lot of institutional support to help you answer those questions, right? Part of it is that we just don't have the answers currently, that many of these outcomes require longitudinal data collecting data over a long period of time, but the pace and scale of development outstrips that by far, right? So uncertainty permeates the situation. So does powerlessness. The idea that even if people knew what the risks were, how to assess them, what the actual health problems could be, they don't feel as if there's an institutional context where they can have a seat at the table to have any power in making decisions about levels of risk or public health. Especially when we live in a home rule state, where local communities are supposed to have the right to zone and regulate this activity within their borders, and every other industry has to adhere to that currently, except this one. People are unsure how to realize procedural equity, how to have a seat at the table, and there's little trust in state institutions, partially as a result of the Colorado Supreme Court decisions that are still kind of coming down the pike for us. So there's strong evidence here of diminished quality of life and increased stress. Community tensions and social stressors are palpable in multiple communities across Colorado. There are stark divides, and we see that industry meta-power is enhanced. What meta-power means is the industry has the power to control the rules of the game, right? The industry has all the seats at the table according to what people are telling us in the field. So this matters in terms of how we create more procedural equity. Just a little slide kind of summarizing that for you. I want to leave you with some photos that we have gotten. I've taken some of these, like this is an aerial photo taken behind one of those sound barriers above Weld County from Lighthawk, this wonderful nonprofit that lets scientists look at what's going on from an aerial view, and we can kind of see all of the infrastructure involved. And I want to point out, this isn't showing up super well in this photo, but at the top left of this photo is a road. There are homes right at the other side of that road, right across from this activity. These other photos are just from Photo Voice. That's a method where we ask people living in these contexts to take pictures of what their daily experience is like. So these photos were taken by participants in our study. This is taken from the roof of one of our study participants who lives near the Triple Creek site and had this sound wall, a 30-foot sound wall this is from her roof, obviously, right? So put about 15 feet from the side of her home. This is a picture sent in by one of our participants of a leak, a water spill, a treated water spill or produced water spill in their neighborhood, and you can see her son riding his bike right around that. This is another view on that spill. And then this was taken during the 2013 floods, right? How infrastructure in the floodplain regions can be impacted by what are going to become more common floods. So I tried to rush through the end of that because I wanted to keep us within time. I'm happy to take a couple questions now, and then like our last presenter, I will be here all day with the exception of having to run home to let my dog out really quickly. So I will be here all day other than that and would love to hear from you and answer questions. And if you all want to participate in an interview, I'm still doing research even though the funding is out. So I'm happy to talk to you a little bit more about that. Thank you so much.
Thank you. I'm going to give you this in 1 second.
Okay.
Thank you, Stephanie. We'll answer a couple questions now. We've scheduled this day pretty tightly, so there isn't a ton of time for question and answer, but we don't want to squelch the asking of questions. What we'd like to propose, we'll try to address as many as we can during today's symposium, and we'll keep all the questions, ask our presenters to answer them in writing, and they'll be posted to the website as well with the presentation. So please don't not ask your questions, and we'll get to as many of them today here as we can.
Thank you, Mike.
Thank you.
Okay, so I think I'll just take the top one. Okay, so this question asks, do you have any suggestions on how to address inequities in oil and gas exposure to minorities and/or vulnerable populations? How do we address environmental racism? Ooh, we should all sign up for my environmental justice class that I'm teaching right now. No, I'm just kidding. This is an enormous systemic question, right? There's so much research out there looking at the problem, and I agree with this question that we need to focus on what are the solutions, right? How can we build capacity to counter this sort of inequity and injustice? In this case, in Colorado, my biggest observation, and I've said this in many settings, is that we need to be building coalitions across all of the groups in our neighborhoods and communities that have mobilized to try to have more public control over this activity. Because when we think about sites like Bella Romero, for example, a prime example of environmental racism, there was just a little clip on the Daily Show about this, right? There are reasons why the well pads that are there ended up there, and part of it is because the institutional context pits us against each other, right, if we're members of the public, where some of our only avenues for power are to find alternative sites that these operators can locate in instead. And what often happens is those alternative sites end up being the most vulnerable places that just don't have the opportunity to respond for a variety of reasons, right? In large part because of lack of power and lack of resources. So we really want to make sure that we are encouraging coalition building so that powerful community organizations can become even more powerful and can link in these other neighborhoods and groups that don't have that power to organize, some of whom are undocumented and feel incredibly vulnerable on top of the vulnerabilities they're already experiencing. I hope that answered the question. I'm happy to answer more, and sorry I couldn't get to all of them. Thank you.
Thanks again.
If you don't mind, sorry.